The courthouse of Millstone County had never seen anything like it. On most days, the old brick building stood quietly on the corner of Main and Willow, its white columns streaked with decades of rain and soot. But that morning, the courthouse looked like the epicenter of a storm. Reporters swarmed the steps, microphones extended like weapons. Satellite vans crowded the streets, their metal dishes pointing skyward. Police had set up barriers to hold back the sea of curious onlookers, though nothing could silence the constant hum of speculation. Inside, every wooden bench was filled. The creak of the courthouse doors was followed by the shuffle of people desperate for seats, some standing in the aisles when no more could be found. Teachers, shopkeepers, retirees, and even teenagers cutting class had come. They wanted to see it with their own eyes. The trial of Daniel Mercer, the man accused of the crime that had split the town clean in two. Daniel Mercer was no stranger. For years, he had been the friendly neighbor who offered a wave from his porch, the quiet man who ran errands at the hardware store. To some, he was harmless. To others, there had always been something unsettling in his stillness, a darkness they couldn't quite name. When the accusations came, the town erupted. Some insisted he was guilty from the start. Others swore it was a witch hunt, the media twisting shadows into monsters. The charges were heavy, unthinkable, the kind of words people whispered instead of spoke aloud. But the truth was murky. Evidence was thin fragments of clothing, inconsistent witness statements, and the testimony of a child too young, some said, to remember anything clearly. The prosecution had built its case carefully, stringing together a narrative of suspicion. The defense, on the other hand, had torn through it with surgical precision, pointing out every gap, every lack of certainty. For weeks, the jury had sat listening, faces grim, scribbling notes, but betraying little emotion. They heard the experts, the investigators, the neighbors who thought they saw something, but couldn't be sure. Each day ended with murmurs that rippled out of the courthouse and spilled into every diner, gas station, and bar in town. Millstone was no longer divided by politics or class. It was divided by guilt and innocence. This day, however, felt different. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense that something monumental was about to happen. The prosecution had announced its final witness. The name hadn't been revealed publicly, but rumors flew. An investigator with new evidence, perhaps, or a neighbor with a shocking revelation. When Judge Evelyn Carter entered, the crowd hushed immediately. She was a woman of stern presence, silver hair tied back, her reputation for fairness known throughout the state. "All rise," the bailiff called, his voice echoing against the high ceilings. The trial resumed. The prosecution's lead attorney, Michael Grant, rose from his seat. His tie was perfectly knotted, his expression calm but sharp. He knew the room was hungry. He let the silence stretch a moment before speaking. "Your Honor, the state calls its final witness," he said. His words rang like a bell. "The witness is a minor. We ask the court's patience and protection." A ripple of surprise coursed through the gallery. "A child?" People craned their necks, whispering. The defense attorney, a tall man named Richard Haw, smirked openly. To him, this was a gift. Children were unreliable. Children could be led, confused, dismissed. This testimony, he thought, would collapse under its own weight. The bailiff opened the side door, and a hush fell instantly over the courtroom. In stepped a small figure, dwarfed by the size of the chamber. A child of 6, clutching a worn teddy bear with one arm, the other hand gripped tightly by a social worker. The child's eyes darted nervously across the room, at the judge, the jury, the rows of strangers staring like statues. The teddy bear looked almost alive, squeezed so tightly it seemed strained. Gasps filled the gallery. This wasn't the hardened investigator or seasoned expert people had expected. This was innocence itself, barely tall enough to see over the railing of the witness stand. Judge Carter's voice softened. We remind all present that this is a child. There will be no outbursts, no intimidation. The jury will give full consideration to the testimony, regardless of age. The child was sworn in, voice trembling, but clear enough to repeat the oath. The courtroom felt frozen, as if even the air held its breath. Daniel Mercer, seated at the defense table, finally showed a flicker of emotion. For weeks he had sat stoically, hands folded, expression unreadable. But now his jaw tightened. His eyes narrowed. He glanced at his attorney, who leaned in and whispered something meant to reassure. The prosecutor began gently. Can you tell us your name? The child whispered, then spoke louder when asked again. The voice was soft but carried. The jury leaned forward, listening with unexpected intensity. Do you remember why you're here today? The prosecutor asked. The child hesitated. The teddy bear was hugged closer. For a moment, the silence seemed unbearable. Then the defense attorney rose, already pouncing. Objection, Your Honor. This witness is clearly overwhelmed. Their testimony will be unreliable. His tone dripped with condescension. Judge Carter's gavel struck once. Overruled. The witness may continue. The prosecutor nodded gently. Take your time. You're safe here. The child's eyes flickered across the room again and stopped. Not on the prosecutor. Not on the accused. But on something else. Something sitting quietly, almost forgotten, at the far end of the room. A police dog? The K-9 officer had been present every day, seated beside his handler, Officer James Rowe. Most people had barely noticed him. The dog's fur was sleek, his eyes alert but calm. To the child, however, the sight was transformative. A flicker of recognition lit in those young eyes, as if a door had just opened in their memory. The teddy bear loosened, ever so slightly. The defense smirked again, oblivious. To him, this was a circus, a performance destined to collapse. But to those watching closely, something had shifted. The child stared at the dog, lips parting as though words were struggling to escape. The prosecutor glanced at the jury, then back at the child. He knew something important was about to happen. He just didn't know what. The gallery sat in perfect silence, waiting. The trial that had divided Millstone County now hinged on the smallest, most unlikely witness of all. And though no one could have known it yet, when that tiny voice finally spoke, the course of the entire case and the town itself would change forever. The moment the child stepped into the witness stand, the atmosphere inside the courtroom shifted like a sudden change in weather. The jurors, who had sat through endless days of adult testimony police officers in crisp uniforms, forensic experts with charts, neighbors recounting half-forgotten observations, now found themselves staring at a figure so small they barely fit into the large wooden chair. A booster cushion was quickly slid beneath them, raising the little witness high enough to see above the polished railing. The child's feet dangled, not reaching the floor. They tapped nervously against the wood, thump, 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 each sound echoing faintly in the heavy silence. The teddy bear was still clutched tightly, its one glass eye seeming to watch the courtroom alongside its owner. Michael Grant, the prosecutor, adjusted his glasses and approached slowly. His movements were careful, deliberate, as though he were nearing a skittish bird that might take flight at the slightest noise. He had prepared for this moment meticulously, yet as he looked at the small figure before him, he felt the weight of uncertainty. How much could a 6-year-old really handle? Could they speak clearly enough, bravely enough, for their testimony to matter? On the other side of the room, Richard Hawley leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, lips curled into a smirk. He whispered something to Daniel Mercer, the accused. Mercer didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the child, unblinking. His jaw worked slightly, a muscle twitching in irritation or perhaps unease. Hale noticed but ignored it, confident the moment would collapse in their favor. Judge Carter broke the silence, her tone softer than usual. "Little one, do you know why you're here?" The child nodded, but did not speak. The judge offered a kind smile. "It's all right. You can take your time." A murmur rose from the gallery. Parents in the audience leaned forward instinctively, as though wanting to protect the small witness themselves. Reporters scribbled furiously, recognizing that what they were witnessing was extraordinary. A child on the stand was rare. A child in a case this serious was unheard of. The prosecutor crouched slightly to meet the child's eyes. "We're just going to talk, okay? Just like we practiced." The child nodded again, their tiny fingers picking at the fur of the teddy bear. The prosecutor continued gently. "Can you tell us your name?" The child hesitated, then whispered. The name was barely audible, but enough. The jury smiled faintly, softening, humanized by the innocence of the voice. "Can you tell us how old you are?" "6," came the reply, just a little louder this time. The prosecutor smiled encouragingly. "And do you remember the night when the police came?" The teddy bear was hugged tighter. The child's mouth opened, but no words came. A long pause stretched uncomfortably. The prosecutor glanced at the judge. Richard Hale was on his feet instantly. "Your Honor, this is absurd. The child can't answer basic questions without freezing. Their testimony will be unreliable. I move to have this witness excused before the jury is swayed by pity rather than fact." The gallery erupted in whispers. Judge Carter's gavel slammed once, then twice. The room fell silent again. "Mr. Hale," the judge said sharply, "you will sit down. This witness is sworn, and this court will hear what they have to say." Hale sat with a flourish of disdain, as though confident the outcome would still be in his favor. He leaned toward Mercer again. "Don't worry," he whispered. "The kid won't last 5 minutes." But Mercer didn't answer. His eyes remained locked on the child, unblinking. The prosecutor cleared his throat softly. "It's okay," he said to the child. "You're safe here. Nobody can hurt you. Just tell us what you remember." The child's eyes flickered across the room past the prosecutor, past the jury, and then, almost involuntarily, toward the defense table. Daniel Mercer's eyes were waiting, cold and heavy. The child froze, shrinking slightly into the chair. Gasps rose from the audience, sensing the unspoken tension. The prosecutor followed the child's gaze and quickly stepped into the line of sight, blocking Mercer from view. "Don't look there," he said softly. "Look at me." Still the child hesitated. Then something shifted. The child's eyes moved past the prosecutor's shoulder farther, toward the corner of the courtroom, where Officer Rowe sat with his K-9 partner. The German shepherd lay still, regal, his dark eyes calm and steady. The child's face changed. Recognition flickered there, faint but real. The prosecutor noticed. He followed the child's gaze and then looked back, puzzled but intrigued. "Do you see someone you know?" he asked. The child nodded slowly. "Can you tell us who?" The child raised a small hand, trembling but deliberate, and pointed across the courtroom. Gasps rippled through the crowd, not because of who they thought would be chosen, but because of who was. Not Mercer, not a juror, not anyone human at all. The finger pointed directly at the police dog. The room erupted in whispers. The judge slammed her gavel again. "Order! Order in the court!" The child's lips parted. For a moment, no sound came. Then, with a voice soft but carrying, the words emerged. He found it." The silence that followed was electric. The prosecutor leaned forward sharply, heart pounding. What did he find? The child swallowed hard, then hugged the teddy bear closer. He found where he hid it. The gallery gasped again. The jury's heads snapped toward the prosecutor, then the defense. Richard Hawley bolted upright. Objection. Leading the witness, speculation, nonsense, this is outrageous. But the judge's gavel thundered again. Mr. Hawley, sit down. The prosecutor, eyes wide, turned back to the child. His voice was careful, barely more than a whisper. Who hid it? The child's eyes dropped to the teddy bear, then flicked back up at Mercer, just for a second. That glance was enough. Mercer shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his calm exterior cracking for the first time. A bead of sweat slid down his temple. The prosecutor straightened, his pulse racing. He turned toward the judge. Your Honor, the witness has just provided corroboration of evidence previously thought circumstantial. We request immediate review of the K-9 officer's findings. The judge's face was unreadable, but her eyes narrowed. Granted. The jury whispered among themselves, their once neutral expressions now sharpened with interest. The gallery buzzed, barely contained by the threat of the gavel. Richard Hawley sat down slowly, his smirk gone. For the first time in the trial, he looked unsettled. He leaned toward Mercer again, but this time Mercer didn't even glance at him. The accused sat stiffly, eyes fixed on the child who had just turned the tide of the entire case with a single pointed finger. And the child, no longer trembling, leaned back against the witness stand, clutching the teddy bear, but calmer now. Their job wasn't over yet, but in that single moment, the entire town knew this wasn't the weak witness everyone expected. This was the voice that might change everything. The jury had heard of the police dog before. His name had come up in testimony, briefly mentioned during the early days of the trial, but no one had paid much attention. A dog, after all, could not testify. At most, he was treated as another tool of law enforcement, like a fingerprint kit or a flashlight useful, but ultimately mute. Yet after the child's trembling finger pointed across the courtroom, silence fell with a weight heavier than words. All eyes shifted to the far corner, to the animal that had been there every day, unseen and unnoticed. The German shepherd sat beside Officer James Rowe, his handler. The dog's ears were pricked, his posture relaxed yet alert. His coat gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, every muscle taut beneath the surface. He was not restless. He did not fidget or bark. He simply sat there, steady as stone, watching. And for the first time in weeks, Daniel Mercer's mask cracked. He shifted in his chair, jaw tight, hands curling into fists beneath the defense table. His lawyer, Richard Hawley, leaned toward him, whispering sharply, "Stay calm. It's a dog. Nothing more." But Mercer didn't answer. His eyes never left the animal. The jury noticed. Jurors who had been slouching now leaned forward, studying both the child and the dog. Some tilted their heads, curious, others suspicious. The defense had worked hard to discredit forensic details, to poke holes in every account. But how did one poke holes in innocence? How did one explain away a child's recognition of the dog that had found evidence? Officer Rowe felt the weight of the room suddenly bear down on him. For weeks he had sat quietly, proud but unnoticed. He knew his partner's worth. Together, they had tracked missing persons, found hidden contraband, uncovered evidence that human eyes had missed. But never had his dog been thrust into the center of a courtroom. Never had the animal's role been magnified by a child's testimony. The prosecutor, Michael Grant, glanced toward Rowe. Their eyes met. A silent message passed between them. This could be the break we needed. "Your Honor," Grant said cautiously, "with the court's permission." I'd like to call Officer James Rowe for testimony regarding the canine's role in this investigation. Immediately, Hawley sprang to his feet. Objection. Your Honor, this is improper. The child's words are vague at best, and we cannot allow theatrics involving a dog to sway the jury. This is a court of law, not a circus. Judge Carter fixed him with a sharp glare. Mr. Hawley, you will sit down. The court will hear the testimony. The child's words directly referenced the canine's findings. We cannot ignore that. Hawley sat fuming. Mercer's knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of the table. Officer Rowe rose from his seat, adjusting his uniform. He led the German shepherd forward, the dog trotting beside him with quiet dignity. The courtroom followed every step, eyes tracking the animal as if he were more than flesh and fur, as if he were a witness himself. Rowe placed his hand gently on the dog's harness and stood at the witness stand. His voice was steady, professional. My name is Officer James Rowe. I am a certified canine handler with the Millstone Police Department. This is Rex, my partner. He gestured to the dog, who sat calmly, tongue lolling slightly. Grant began his questioning carefully. Officer Rowe, can you explain the role your partner played in the investigation involving the defendant, Daniel Mercer? Rowe nodded. Yes, sir. During the search of the defendant's property, Rex was deployed to track and locate any items connected to the victim. He indicated several areas, including a shed behind the residence. Grant leaned forward. And what did you find in that shed? Rowe took a deep breath. Inside a locked container, we recovered a child's toy and clothing articles consistent with the victim's belongings. The jury stiffened. The gallery gasped audibly. These were the very items that had been dismissed as circumstantial by the defense. Grant pressed on. And was this discovery documented? Yes, sir. The items were logged, photographed, and entered into evidence. But without corroborating testimony, their connection to the defendant remained disputed. Now the room understood. The child had provided the missing link. Grant gestured toward the small witness, still clutching the teddy bear. Officer, you've heard what the child just testified. That Rex, your partner, found where it was hidden. Does that testimony align with your professional experience? Yes, Rowe said firmly. The child's statement is accurate. Rex's alerts led us directly to the hidden items. Without him, we may never have found them. The murmurs in the gallery swelled again. Richard Hawley exploded to his feet. This is outrageous. Your Honor, this so-called testimony is nothing more than emotional manipulation. We're allowing the jury to be swayed by a dog and the imagination of a child. The judge's gavel cracked like a gunshot. Sit down, Mr. Hawley. You will respect this process. But Hawley wasn't done. He rounded on the witness. Officer Rowe, isn't it true that canine alerts can be subjective? That handlers can unintentionally influence their dogs? Rowe's jaw tightened. That's a common misconception. Rex is trained to a national standard. His alerts are tested and validated regularly. He has a proven track record of accuracy in the field. Yet you expect this jury to convict the man based on a dog's nose? Hawley sneered. Rowe didn't flinch. I expect this jury to consider that a child recognized the truth when adults tried to overlook it. The words landed like a punch. Even Hawley faltered. The prosecutor allowed the silence to linger before speaking again. Officer Rowe, in your professional opinion, were the items found in that shed deliberately hidden? Yes, Rowe said. The container was buried beneath debris. Someone intended for it not to be found. And yet, Grant finished, his voice steady, your partner found it. And today, a child confirmed it. The judge looked toward the jury. Their faces had changed. No longer passive, they were alert, engaged, some even angry. The narrative had shifted entirely. What once seemed circumstantial now looked deliberate. In the back row, a woman clasped her hands together and whispered, "That dog saved that child." Her words rippled, echoed by nods from others. The accused shifted again. Sweat dampened his collar. His eyes flickered toward the jury, then back to the dog, whose gaze remained steady, unblinking. For the first time, Daniel Mercer looked less like a man falsely accused and more like a man cornered. The judge dismissed the court for recess, her gavel striking with authority. But the damage was done. As people rose and the buzz filled the air, one thing was clear. The silent presence of a dog had just changed the trial forever. The silence inside the courtroom was almost unbearable. The wooden benches creaked under the shifting weight of restless spectators, but not a word was spoken. Even the hum of the ceiling fan seemed to fade into the background as all eyes rested on the small figure seated in the witness box. The child, barely 6 years old, clutched a worn teddy bear to their chest as if it were the only thing tethering them to safety. The soft brown fabric of the toy was frayed from years of comfort, and one button eye hung loosely, but in that moment it was more than a toy. It was armor. The prosecutor leaned forward, his voice gentle, almost whisper-like, as though speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile trust of the child. "Can you tell us what you remember about that night?" he asked softly. The child's lips quivered. A faint sound escaped, but it dissolved before forming into words. The courtroom leaned forward, straining to hear, but the silence won. Tears pooled at the edges of the child's wide eyes. A wave of discomfort rippled across the room. Some jurors shifted in their seats, uneasy. The defense attorney, tall and broad-shouldered, stood abruptly. "Your Honor," he said, his voice sharp, slicing through the silence. "This witness is clearly too young, too traumatized, to provide any credible testimony. This is nothing more than theatrics meant to sway the jury emotionally." He smirked, confident that the fragile silence of the child worked in his favor. The judge narrowed her eyes, but didn't immediately respond. Instead, she looked at the child, her voice calm and steady. "You're safe here?" she said gently. "Take your time. No one can hurt you." But the words, while kind, did not loosen the child's fear. Their small hands tightened around the teddy bear, knuckles turning white. The room grew restless. Murmurs stirred at the back, reporters whispering as they scribbled into their notebooks. If the child could not speak, the defense would succeed in dismissing the testimony entirely. Just as the judge prepared to address the objection, something extraordinary happened. The child's trembling hand lifted slowly, hesitantly, and then extended outward. Tiny fingers pointed across the room, not at the accused, not at the attorneys, not at the jury. Instead, they pointed directly at the police dog lying calmly beside his handler near the far side of the courtroom. Gasps rippled through the room like a sudden gust of wind. Even the judge sat back in her chair, eyebrows arched. The defense attorney turned, incredulous, as if expecting some trick. What could the child possibly mean by pointing at a dog? The courtroom held its breath. The dog, a large German shepherd with intelligent eyes, lifted his head, ears twitching at the sudden attention. He didn't bark or stir. He simply looked back at the child with a steady, unblinking gaze, as though recognizing the unspoken connection between them. The prosecutor leaned closer, cautious not to break the fragile thread of courage that seemed to flicker inside the child. "Do you mean the dog?" he asked softly. The child's lips trembled again. Then, in the smallest voice barely audible to those in the first row, they whispered, "The dog. He found it." The courtroom exploded with murmurs. Some gasped. Others whispered furiously, trying to piece together what those words could mean. The judge pounded her gavel. "Order! "Order in the court," she commanded, but the shock lingered. The defense attorney jumped to his feet. "Objection. This is nonsense. A child pointing at a dog is not testimony. This is absurd." His face was red, voice rising in desperation. But the judge did not silence the child. Instead, she leaned forward. "What did the dog find?" she asked gently, her tone warm, coaxing, as though inviting a secret to finally be told. The child's small chest rose and fell with nervous breaths. At last, the words came out, halting but clear. "He found the place. Where he hid it." The room froze. The jury exchanged startled looks. The spectators leaned forward. Reporters scratched their pens furiously against paper. The prosecutor's eyes widened. "What place?" the prosecutor asked carefully. The child's voice grew stronger now, steadied by the fact that everyone was listening, not mocking, not dismissing, but listening. "The bad man put my toy there," the child said. "The dog. He smelled it. He found it." The teddy bear was hugged tighter. The child's words were simple, but the implication was staggering. The prosecutor turned to the evidence table, rifling through files until he found a photograph one taken by police during the investigation. It showed a box of evidence pulled from an abandoned shed outside of town. Among the items was a small toy belonging to the child. At the time, investigators had logged it but failed to connect it directly to the accused. Now, the child's testimony connected the dots in front of the jury. The accused shifted in his seat, sweat glistening on his brow. For weeks, he had sat smugly, convinced that the lack of hard evidence would save him. Now a 6-year-old child, with nothing but courage and memory, was pulling apart the very defense he had clung to. The defense attorney barked another objection, voice cracking under the weight of panic. "This is outrageous. A child pointing at a dog cannot be considered credible evidence." The judge's gavel struck again. "Objection noted," she said, her voice stern. "But this court will hear the child out." The child looked back at the dog again, as if drawing strength from its steady gaze. "He's a good dog," the child said softly. "He knew. He showed the police. He found my toy where the bad man hid it." It was a simple truth, spoken in the unshakable honesty of a child. And sometimes, truth, no matter how small or fragile, could shatter the strongest lies. The jury leaned in, captivated. The defense attorney sat down heavily, his arguments crumbling before the purity of a child's voice. The judge, for once, did not hide the flicker of emotion crossing her face. What began as a faint whisper had now become the loudest voice in the room. The child had spoken. The dog had been pointed out. And with just those few words, the entire trial had shifted. The courtroom was no longer divided between speculation and doubt. It was now bound by the undeniable connection between a tiny witness, a loyal police dog, and the truth they uncovered together. For the first time since the trial began, the accused looked cornered, not by lawyers, not by evidence charts, but by the unshakable honesty of innocence. And though the trial was far from over, everyone in that room knew the case would never be the same again. The moment the child's trembling voice carried through the courtroom, he found the place where he hid it, the very air seemed to shift. It was as if invisible walls had crumbled. For weeks, the trial had been a maze of half-truths, legal maneuvering, and technicalities. But in that instant, clarity cut through like a knife. Jurors leaned forward in unison, eyes locked on the small witness who had just uttered the simplest yet most devastating statement of the trial. The prosecutor paused, stunned by the child's courage, before quickly seizing the moment. He walked a few steps closer to the witness stand, careful not to overwhelm. "You said the dog found something," the prosecutor asked softly. "Can you tell us what the dog found?" The child swallowed, gripping the teddy bear tighter. "He found my toy. The one the bad man took." The words were tiny, fragile, but each syllable rang louder than a shout. The prosecutor nodded slowly, almost reverently. He turned toward the evidence table and lifted a sealed plastic bag. Inside was a small stuffed rabbit, its ears bent and worn from years of handling. Gasps echoed across the room. Some jurors covered their mouths in disbelief. "Your Honor," the prosecutor said, holding the bag high, "this item was recovered from the shed where the police dog Rex tracked evidence during the investigation. Until now, its connection to this case was unclear. But the witness has identified it." All eyes shifted to the accused. His face had drained of color. For weeks, he had hidden behind his lawyer's confidence, smug in the belief that the absence of a clear connection between the evidence and the crime would save him. But now, a child had bridged that gap with words as unshakable as stone. The defense attorney jumped to his feet, desperation lacing every word. "Objection. This is outrageous. A 6-year-old cannot possibly establish a chain of custody. This is highly prejudicial and irrelevant." The judge slammed her gavel, the crack echoing like a thunderclap. "Overruled. The jury will decide what weight to give this testimony." A low hum of whispers swept through the gallery. Reporters scribbled furiously, knowing the story of the century was unfolding before them. Headlines were already forming in their minds. "Tiny witness identifies evidence. Shocks court." The prosecutor faced the child again. "Can you tell us what happened when you lost this toy?" The child hesitated, tears brimming, then nodded. "The bad man took it. He said I couldn't have it back. But the dog found it." The prosecutor allowed the silence to linger, letting the gravity of the statement settle over the jury. Then he turned, addressing them directly. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is not mere coincidence. The police dog discovered this toy exactly where the defendant was known to have been hiding evidence. The child, without hesitation, has confirmed its significance. This is not a trick of memory. This is truth spoken in innocence." The defense attorney sprang up again, nearly shouting. "Your Honor, this is an emotional ploy. We cannot let a child's story dictate the outcome of a criminal trial." But this time, the judge's patience wore thin. Her gaze hardened. "Sit down, counselor. A court will hear this testimony." The defense lawyer's face flushed crimson, his jaw tightening as he sank back into his chair. His client glared at him with wide, panicked eyes. The once confident man now looked cornered, like a predator caught in its own trap. Meanwhile, the jury couldn't take their eyes off the child. There was no guile, no agenda in that trembling voice. Only truth. And that truth carried a weight no lawyer's spin could dilute. The prosecutor approached the evidence board, where photos and documents were pinned. He gestured to a large image of the shed where the police dog had led investigators. "This," he said, his voice rising with conviction, was dismissed as circumstantial. "A shed containing random items, no direct ties to the accused, until now. The child has told us in their own words that the toy was taken and hidden by the man sitting right there." He pointed at the defendant. "And that toy was found by this dog." Rex, the German shepherd, seemed to sense the attention. His ears perked, his eyes sharp, though he remained obediently seated beside his handler. In that moment, the dog looked less like a silent observer and more like a sworn officer of truth. The courtroom buzzed again, and once more the judge's gavel restored order. But no gavel could undo the shift that had just occurred. The defense's case, once built on doubt and technicalities, had just cracked wide open. The prosecutor returned to the child with one final question. "Do you see the man who took your toy in this courtroom today?" A hush fell so deep, it was as though the world itself stopped to listen. The child's gaze shifted slowly. Tiny hands clutched the teddy bear tighter, but their eyes, brave, unwavering, now lifted toward the defendant. The finger rose, small but steady. "That's him," the child said. The room erupted. Gasps, cries, even shouts from the back. The defendant flinched as if the words themselves had struck him. His lawyer slammed his hand on the table, shouting protests that were drowned out by the rising storm of voices. The judge's gavel struck again and again, demanding silence. But the damage was done. The image was seared into every juror's mind. A child, pointing with innocent certainty, identifying the man accused of the crime. For a moment, even the defense attorney seemed at a loss for words. He sank into his seat, staring at his notes as though they had betrayed him. His client grabbed his arm, whispering furiously, but there was no strategy left to salvage. The jury had seen what they had seen. The prosecutor stepped back, allowing the weight of the moment to linger. He knew no speech could be more powerful than what had just unfolded. Finally, the judge spoke, her voice steady, authoritative. "The witness may step down." The child was gently escorted from the stand, still clutching the teddy bear, eyes darting one last time toward the dog who had silently stood as their protector. The courtroom watched as the tiny figure disappeared behind the door, leaving behind an earthquake in their wake. And as the heavy wooden doors closed, the tension in the room did not ease. If anything, it deepened. Because now, the trial was no longer about speculation or technicalities. It was about a child's courage, a dog's instincts, and a man's unraveling lies. The jurors exchanged grim, knowing looks. Reporters whispered of headlines that would spread across the nation. And the defendant, once smug and confident, now sat hunched in his chair, staring at the floor as if it might swallow him whole. The child had spoken. The dog had been pointed out. And together, they had shifted the course of justice. But the trial was not yet over. The defense would fight. The prosecutor would press harder. And the jury, caught between law and conscience, would face the most crucial decision of their lives. Yet no matter what came next, everyone in that courtroom knew one thing. The smallest witness had just delivered the most powerful blow. The courtroom had shifted from tense anticipation to electric disbelief. The child's testimony, delivered with trembling hands and quiet bravery, had broken through the wall of doubt that the defense had built so carefully. And now, as the child disappeared behind the heavy oak doors, escorted out of sight, the echo of those small words, "He found it," still rang through the air like an unshakable truth. Jurors exchanged glances that spoke louder than any argument. Some looked hardened, brows furrowed with new certainty. Others wore expressions of sadness, as if the innocence of the child had struck them deeply. None of them, however, looked uncertain anymore. That alone was enough to send a ripple of panic down the defense attorney's spine. The prosecutor, sensing the shift, moved with deliberate calm. He approached the evidence table once more, pulling out photographs, sealed bags, and logs from the police investigation. For weeks, these items had sat untouched, relegated to the periphery, considered irrelevant or circumstantial. But with the child's words tying them together, each piece suddenly carried new weight. "Your Honor," the prosecutor began, his voice firm but measured, "we have heard testimony that directly links this defendant to evidence previously dismissed. It is time the jury sees the full picture." The defense attorney shot to his feet. "Your Honor, this is absurd. We cannot allow a frightened child's confused memories to rewrite the foundation of this case. This evidence was dismissed for lack of relevance, and nothing has changed." "Sit down, counselor," the judge snapped. Her tone was no longer patient. The defense attorney froze mid-sentence, his face red with frustration, before reluctantly returning to his chair. The prosecutor turned to the jury. He held up a photograph of the shed. This location was uncovered only because of Rex, the canine officer. He gestured toward the German shepherd, who lay poised and calm beside his handler, his very presence a reminder of silent truth. The dog indicated the spot where evidence was hidden. At that time, we could not connect it directly to the accused. But now, he paused for effect, letting the image of the child pointing linger in the jurors' minds. We know this was where the defendant attempted to bury his crimes. One by one, the prosecutor displayed the items. A piece of clothing, fibers matching the victims. A child's stuffed rabbit, identified in open court by the tiny witness. A knife, its blade cleaned, but bearing microscopic traces of blood. The jury's eyes followed each piece like puzzle fragments falling into place. The defense attorney leaned close to his client, whispering furiously. The accused's face was pale, sweat shining on his forehead. He shook his head violently, as though refusing to accept the inevitability unfolding before him. His lips moved, muttering denials too quiet to hear, but his panic was evident. The prosecutor did not let up. "Members of the jury," he said, his voice rising, "this case has been painted as one of uncertainty, of blurred lines and insufficient evidence. But today, a child, one with no motive, no hidden agenda, nothing but honesty, stood here and pointed to the truth. That child remembered. That child told us what happened. And the evidence, once dismissed, now tells the same story." A murmur of agreement moved through the jury box. The defense attorney sprang up again. "Your Honor, I object to this emotional manipulation. We cannot convict a man on the word of a child and the instinct of a dog. This is—" The judge's gavel cut him off. "Counselor, I will not warn you again. Your objections are noted. Sit down." The defense attorney bit his tongue, rage boiling beneath the surface, but the damage was already done. His protest sounded less like strategy and more like desperation. The prosecutor continued. "This dog, Rex, is trained to detect truth where humans fail. His nose led investigators to evidence hidden in a place the defendant thought would never be found. And the child, who suffered through unspeakable trauma, recognized what was taken from them. The connection is undeniable. This is not guesswork. This is truth." Rex's handler, seated quietly at the side, placed a steady hand on the dog's back. The German shepherd didn't move, didn't bark, only held his calm, dignified posture as though he understood his role in unraveling a web of lies. The accused shifted violently in his chair, glaring at the dog as though the animal itself had betrayed him. The irony was not lost on the jury. Here sat a man, caught not by clever lawyers or forensic scientists, but by the instincts of a loyal canine and the honesty of a child. The prosecutor laid out the final blow. For weeks, the defense has claimed that there is no direct tie between this man and the evidence. But now we know the truth. A child pointed to this dog and told us that the defendant hid the toy. And that toy found in the very shed the defendant used proves his guilt. The courtroom erupted in whispers again. Some jurors nodded grimly. Others sat back, visibly shaken by the weight of the testimony. The defense attorney stood once more, his voice trembling with suppressed fury. "Ladies and gentlemen, do not be fooled. Children are impressionable. Dogs cannot speak. What you are being asked to believe is nothing more than coincidence stitched together with emotion. My client is a victim of circumstance, of a system desperate for a scapegoat." But even as he spoke, his words felt hollow. The jury wasn't listening. Their eyes betrayed the truth. The case had shifted beyond his control. The judge raised a hand. "That's enough, counselor. You'll have your turn in closing arguments. For now, the evidence stands." The prosecutor sat, his work for the day complete. The courtroom simmered with tension, but the tide was clear. What had once been a case balanced on a razor's edge now leaned heavily toward conviction. The accused hunched lower in his seat, his eyes darting wildly from jurors to judge to prosecutor. He tugged at his collar, sweat dripping down his temple. The calm, confident mask he had worn throughout the trial had shattered completely. Now he looked like a man unraveling, each thread pulled by forces he could not stop. A child's courage, a dog's instincts, and evidence that no longer sat quietly ignored. The jury sat straighter, as though bracing for the inevitable. They had been led through lies, through smokescreens, through doubt. But now, the truth shone like a beacon, small, pure, and undeniable. And in that truth, the defendant found himself cornered at last. The trial was not yet over. The defense would throw everything they had into discrediting the testimony. They would argue, twist, and protest until their voices gave out. But no matter what they did, the image lingered, the child pointing at the dog. The words trembling but sure. He found it. The chain of truth had been unraveled. And once unraveled, it could never be hidden again. The atmosphere inside the courtroom felt like a storm that had been building for weeks and finally broke. The child's quiet testimony had landed like lightning, and the prosecutor's steady narrative had fanned it into a wildfire. But what came next was not just shock, it was chaos. Whispers burst into murmurs, and murmurs erupted into audible gasps. Some spectators craned their necks to see the accused, as if searching his face for signs of guilt. Others stared at the jurors, hoping to read the decision already forming in their minds. Even the stenographer, trained to remain detached, paused for a fraction of a second before catching herself and continuing to type. The accused sat rigid in his chair, hands gripping the edge of the defense table. Sweat beaded on his forehead, his lips pressed tightly into a line. His lawyer leaned toward him, whispering furiously, but the man barely responded. He was no longer in control, and he knew it. The judge slammed her gavel repeatedly, her voice rising above the uproar. Order, order in this courtroom. I will not tolerate disruptions. It took several moments for the noise to die down, but the tension remained palpable, like the air just before another clap of thunder. The jury, though visibly shaken, composed themselves under the judge's stern gaze. Yet even they couldn't mask the impact the child's words had left. The prosecutor seized the moment. He stood tall, buttoning his jacket as he addressed the jury. What you have just witnessed cannot be undone. Truth, spoken through the innocence of a child, has illuminated this case in a way no lawyer ever could. And that truth has been supported by evidence, uncovered not by chance, but by the instincts of a trained police canine. This is not theatrics. This is justice revealing itself. The words carried across the room, steady and resonant. The defense attorney sprang up in protest, his composure fraying. This is outrageous. My client is being condemned by spectacle. We are not here to indulge in fairy tales of dogs and children. We are here to deal in facts, and facts alone. But even as he spoke, his voice cracked. The jurors' eyes were not with him. They were still fixed on the image etched in their hair. Minds, the trembling finger of a child pointing toward the dog, and then at the accused. A judge gave him a sharp glare. Counselor, you will restrain yourself. You will have your chance to speak during closing arguments. The defense attorney sank back into his seat, visibly rattled. His client's eyes burned into him with a mix of fury and desperation. But what defense could he mount against innocence itself? Reporters scribbled furiously, some even abandoning their notes to whisper excitedly into recording devices. The story had already grown beyond the walls of the courthouse. By nightfall, it would sweep through headlines across the country. Child witness turns trial on its head. Police dog, child testimony shift case. Every word spoken here would ripple outward, shaping public opinion before the gavel even fell on a verdict. The prosecutor continued, pacing slowly before the jury box. This child had no reason to lie, no ulterior motive, no hidden agenda. They spoke the truth, even when it terrified them. That is courage, ladies and gentlemen. Courage born from innocence. And you must ask yourselves, why would a child say such a thing unless it was true? His words landed heavily. Jurors shifted in their seats, each one processing the gravity of the testimony. Some nodded subtly. Others stared at the defendant, their expressions hardening. The accused suddenly leaned forward, slamming his fist on the table. "They're lying," he shouted, his voice raw with desperation. "That kid doesn't know what they're talking about. This is all a setup." The outburst shocked the room. Gasps rang out, and the judge's gavel struck furiously. "Order! Defendant, you will remain silent, or I will have you removed from this courtroom." But the damage was already done. His sudden loss of composure had revealed the fear lurking beneath his facade. The jury watched him closely, their faces reflecting a mix of suspicion and disdain. The prosecutor didn't need to say a word. The defendant had just shown them more than any cross-examination could. The judge ordered a short recess to calm the room. As the jury filed out, whispers followed them like shadows. The spectators leaned toward each other, exchanging theories in hushed tones. The reporters bolted for the hallway, eager to send out breaking updates before the world moved on to the next shock. Inside the courtroom, the defense attorney turned on his client the moment the jurors were gone. His whisper was sharp, venomous. "You just made it worse. Do you understand that? You couldn't keep your mouth shut, and now they think you're guilty." The accused shoved him back, voice low but seething. "You told me this case was airtight. You said they had nothing on me." "I didn't until that kid opened their mouth." The lawyer hissed. He wiped sweat from his brow, pulling at his tie as though the very air had turned against him. "We can still salvage this, but you have to shut up. Let me talk. Let me spin this. That's all we've got left." Across the room, the prosecutor sat calmly, reviewing his notes. He didn't need to press harder. The case was speaking for itself now, louder than he ever could. When the jury returned, the judge restored order, her expression as stern as stone. "This court will proceed, and let it be clear further outbursts from anyone will not be tolerated." The prosecutor resumed his examination of the evidence, each piece now carrying new gravity in the jurors' minds. The stuffed rabbit, the shed, the fibers, the knife. What once seemed disjointed was now a chain, each link connecting directly to the defendant. The defense attorney tried to chip away, objecting wherever possible, raising doubts about chain of custody, questioning the reliability of the dog's tracking. But his words fell flat. The jurors' minds had already been pierced by something he could never unseat, the sincerity of a child. The room felt heavy with inevitability. Even the spectators could sense it. Some shook their heads, others nodded with grim satisfaction. The tide had turned, and no legal trick could stem the flood now. As the day's proceedings closed, the judge reminded the jury of their duty. You are not to discuss this case outside of this courtroom. You are not to read the news or allow outside influence to sway your decision. You will consider only what has been presented here. But everyone knew that the story had already slipped beyond the walls. The jury might be shielded, but the world outside was ablaze. Television crews stood ready. Headlines screamed across every newsroom. And in living rooms across the country, families debated in hushed tones, united in their shock that a child's trembling words and a dog's silent instincts could bring a man to the edge of conviction. Back in the courtroom, the defendant sat slumped in his chair, his bravado gone, his face hollow. The defense attorney shuffled his notes aimlessly, already dreading the futility of his closing arguments. The prosecutor, by contrast, felt a calm resolve. He knew the hardest battles weren't fought with grand speeches or flashy evidence. They were fought with truth. And today, truth had spoken through the most unlikely witness of all. As the gavel struck to adjourn for the day, the courtroom emptied slowly. The jurors left in silence, their faces somber. The spectators spilled into the hallway, voices buzzing with speculation. And somewhere in the shadows of the courthouse, the child was being comforted, far from the chaos, unaware of the storm they had set in motion. But everyone else knew. Tomorrow would bring closing arguments. Tomorrow would bring the final verdict. And tomorrow, justice would no longer be a question, it would be answered. The final day of the trial dawned heavy with anticipation. The courthouse steps were crowded long before the session began. Reporters jostling for position, cameras flashing, and townspeople whispering in clusters. The entire community had been pulled into the orbit of this case. For weeks, tension had wound itself around the town like a tightening rope, and now, at last, the knot would be cut. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was no less charged. The jury sat composed, but visibly burdened, their faces lined with the weight of responsibility. The defendant slouched in his chair, jaw clenched tight, eyes hollow with fatigue. His lawyer shuffled papers aimlessly, but the tremor in his hands betrayed him. Across the aisle, the prosecutor adjusted his tie with calm precision, his eyes clear with conviction. The judge entered, gavel striking once. We will now hear closing arguments before the jury is dismissed to deliberate. The defense attorney rose first. He had rehearsed his words all night, but as he looked at the jury, he sensed their distance. Still, he pressed on, his voice straining to sound confident. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, pacing slowly, "you've heard testimony. You've seen evidence. But you must remember this. Emotion is not fact. A child's fear, a dog's behavior, these are powerful images, yes, but they are not proof beyond a reasonable doubt. My client sits before you presumed innocent, and unless the prosecution can present absolute, uncheckable proof, you must honor that presumption." He gestured toward the accused, who tried to sit taller, though his shoulders sagged beneath invisible weight. "We do not convict on feelings. We do not convict on sympathy. We convict only when the law leaves us no other choice." The words hung in the air, but they landed without force. The jurors' faces remained unmoved. A few scribbled notes, but most simply stared back, silent and guarded. When he finished, the defense attorney's shoulders dropped. He returned to his seat with the weary gait of a man who knew he was losing. Then the prosecutor rose. His voice carried a gravity that immediately drew every ear. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, "you've been asked to ignore what you saw, to turn away from the truth, because it is inconvenient for the defense. But justice demands that we look directly at the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it is." He moved deliberately, standing close to the jury box. "You saw a child, trembling with fear, yet brave enough to speak. A child who pointed, without hesitation, at the one man responsible for their suffering. A child who recognized the silent loyalty of a police dog that led us to evidence hidden away in a shed. That was not coincidence. That was not imagination. That was truth." He held up the stuffed rabbit, sealed in an evidence bag. This toy was buried in the accused's shed. Not across town, not in some stranger's home, his shed. Fibers from the child's clothing were found inside. His fingerprints are on the knife. The chain of evidence is unbroken. The truth has been pieced together, brick by brick, and it points to one man, and one man alone. The courtroom was silent, but for the prosecutor's steady voice. "You are the guardians of justice in this case. That child found the courage to speak the truth in this very courtroom. Will you find the courage to uphold it?" He paused, letting the weight of the moment sink in. Then quietly, he concluded, "Justice is not blind. Justice sees through the eyes of truth. And today, that truth demands a guilty verdict. When he sat down, the room remained hushed. The judge gave her instructions to the jury, her voice formal and unwavering. Then the jurors filed out, each step echoing against the marble floors, the doors closing behind them like the seal on a vault. The wait was agonizing. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the shuffling of feet and the occasional cough. Reporters typed hurried updates, their words chasing rumors that spread outside like wildfire. The defendant sat motionless, his face pale, his lawyer whispering half-hearted reassurances that even he didn't believe. Finally, the buzzer sounded. The jury had reached a verdict. The room filled instantly, silence descending like a heavy curtain as the judge called the court to order. The jury filed back in, faces unreadable. The foreperson stood, holding the folded verdict slip. "Members of the jury," the judge said, "have you reached a verdict?" "Yes, Your Honor," the foreperson replied, voice steady. The bailiff carried the paper to the judge, who glanced at it before returning it. "Please read the verdict." The foreperson unfolded the slip, eyes scanning the words. Then, in a clear voice that cut through the silence, they spoke. "In the case of the state versus the defendant, on the charge of child endangerment and aggravated assault, we the jury find the defendant guilty." A collective gasp filled the courtroom. Some spectators cheered before the judge's gavel restored order. The defendant's face crumpled, his body sinking into his chair, as though the weight of the verdict crushed him. His lawyer sat stunned, eyes fixed on the table. The prosecutor exhaled slowly, a quiet relief washing over him. He glanced toward the corner where the child sat with a guardian, and his eyes softened. Justice had spoken, not through him, but through truth itself. The judge addressed the defendant with cold authority. "You have been found guilty by a jury of your peers. Sentencing will be scheduled at a later date. Until then, you are remanded into custody." Two bailiffs stepped forward. The defendant resisted for a moment, his face twisted with anger, but it was useless. The handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists, and he was led away, his footsteps heavy, his fate sealed. The courtroom buzzed again, this time not with shock, but with the energy of closure. Reporters rushed out to deliver breaking news, their headlines already writing themselves. Guilty verdict in shocking trial. Child's courage. Dog's loyalty lead to justice. But inside, amid the commotion, one moment stood apart. The child, small and weary, looked toward the police dog sitting calmly at its handler's side. The dog's ears perked, eyes steady, as though it understood. The child gave a timid smile, lifting a small hand in thanks. The dog's tail thumped once against the floor, a silent acknowledgement of a bond no words could capture. In the days that followed, the story spread far beyond the town. News programs replayed footage of the child's testimony. Experts discussed the unprecedented weight of the dog's role. And communities across the nation praised the courage it took for such a young witness to speak. The prosecutor received letters of thanks from strangers. The police department honored the K9 with a Medal of Service, recognizing not only his skill, but his unwavering instinct. And the child, though still haunted by shadows, was surrounded by support, embraced by a community determined to protect them. In the courtroom's aftermath, a single truth remained. Justice had not come easily. It had been wrestled from fear, fought for through innocence, and delivered by a voice so small it nearly went unheard. But when that voice was finally raised, it shook the walls of a courthouse and echoed across a nation. The story would be told again and again, not just of the crime, not just of the trial, but of the day when a tiny witness pointed at a police dog and spoke, and the world listened. And what followed didn't just shock the court. It reminded everyone that sometimes the greatest truths come from the smallest voices, and the purest justice from those who cannot even speak for themselves.